Number 1. The mustard gas experiment. During World War II, the United States conducted mustard gas experiments on American soldiers as part of a chemical warfare research. Mustard gas, a well-known blister agent during those times, stood among the most infamous chemical weapons employed in combat. These experiments aimed to examine the consequences of mustard gas exposure and create efficient remedies and safeguards for soldiers. So immediately, the Department of Defense asked soldiers, probably those with 17 to 18 years of age, to show up and be part of this exciting experiment that will help shorten the war. Curiosity having taken the better of them, many showed up in the lab for this great occasion. But things were not as pleasing as they thought it would be, because they were told mustard gas would be involved, and this made quite a number of them to back off, leaving the remaining, who to my knowledge, seemed to have little to zero idea about this gas. Nearly 60,000 military personnel were involved in a wide range of exposures, with most of them being mild, like, for example, having a drop of the agent being put on a patch test on the arm to test ointments. The other 4,000 soldiers were subjected to severe full-body exposures. For those of you who don't know yet, mustard gas is an extremely dangerous poisonous gas that, when exposed to the liquid version or the vapor version, you may end up with severe burns to your eyes and skin. Again, these burns could turn to painful blisters, and if this gas is inhaled, it can irritate and even cause severe burns in your esophagus and lungs, and could even kill you if exposure is prolonged. So, as expected, many soldiers who were exposed to this dangerous gas ended up having the symptoms I just mentioned. Number 2. Holmesburg Prison Experiments. If you ever come to think of an evil scientist, then Dr. Albert M. Kligman should be the first person to appear in your mind. You know what he did? Okay, let me break it down for you. In the early 1950s, Dr. Albert began his research to foster the training of young dermatology residents, and he quickly came to understand that the human flotsam and jetsam incarcerated in the city's prisons were too valuable of a commodity. So, within a short time, Kligman, with the support of the dermatology department of the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, moved from their usual rudimentary studies to a more sophisticated and dangerous investigation. In 1958, he gathered a group of healthy, colored male volunteers aged between 20 to 45 years to be inoculated in his first experiment. In this study, he had the prisoners inoculated with variants like the ectodermotropic viruses such as wart virus, herpes simplex, herpes zoster, and vaccinia. In the wart virus section of the study, 47 inoculations were performed in 7 volunteers in different skin areas like the forearm, palm, face, scalp, and penis. And you know what, bro, all of these recipients developed at least 1 lesion, and some of them 2 lesions at different locations. And, as if that wasn't enough, in mid-1960s, Dr. Albert, still in his quest for money, went ahead and started developing interest in nuclear medicine. Therefore, he sought to use radioactive isotopes in his clinical investigations. After being granted authority by those on top to use the Philadelphia prison, Dr. Albert injected his subjects with a radioactive material, which to my knowledge is more cancerous, and ironically, the busy doc actually had no knowledge or training on how to use the radioactive material, and you can guess exactly what happened after that. You thought he stopped there? No. In 1964, Kligman went further with his ambition and exposed inmates to dioxin, a highly toxic and dangerous carcinogenic substance. Caring less about them, he had the dioxin applied on the faces and backs of dozens of prisoners, with the vast majority being African American. Amazingly, the unknowing prisoners agreed to this, receiving only $1 a day for renting out a piece of their skin, as Mr. Kligman received $10,000 for his services. Number 3. Totskoye Nuclear Exercises Test. You know that situation when the government decides to sacrifice its own army in some warlike experiments? Now, the Totskoye incident is one large massacre that quickly subsided with the wind as years passed. You see, the aim of this exercise was to help the Soviets fully understand a weapon that had been unveiled and its effects on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. To make you understand this better, the Soviets were interested in how to fight in a world of tactical and strategic nuclear weapons. So, an army of around 45,000 men was gathered in Totskoye to take part in Operation Snowball, or as some may call it, Operation Light Snow. The army was led by Zhukov Georgy, a well-known marshal of the Soviet Union and a praised hero of the Second World War. The army initiated maneuvers, deploying a variety of equipment including 320 planes, 600 armored personal carriers, and 600 tanks. The soldiers were informed that they would be participating in a standard military drill involving simulated nuclear explosion. Consequently, no one was allowed to have a protective gear, and the soldiers would do this with their bare selves. Interestingly, their man on the front, Mr. Zhukov, did the unexpected thing by cowardly going to hide in an underground nuclear bunker, leaving the innocent men to face what was about to happen. Right after the bomb detonated successfully with a force equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT, similar to the one dropped by the United States on Hiroshima, Air Force planes received orders to bomb the explosion site. This initial bombardment was met with another barrage 3 hours later. Following this, armored vehicles were directed to simulate the capture of the enemy area that had undergone a nuclear attack. They would be followed by infantry. Soon after the shockwave subsided, it was in this moment that troops with little or no protective gear were filmed storming through an inferno of dust, heat, and radiation that turned many of them into barbecue meat. Number 4. Japan's Unit 731 experiments. There's this place in Japan known as Pinfang that had a unit which was responsible for the persecution and torture of very many prisoners of war, and at least 3,000 men, women, and even children would not miss the jaws of Unit 731. Sounds creepy, right? But what if I added to your fear that these people were actually subjects for several dangerous experiments? Now, let's start. Frostbite testing. There was this physicist known as Yoshimura Hisato in Unit 731 who was very curious to understand the reaction of humans to frostbites. Hisato would routinely submerge his victims' limbs into a tub of water filled with ice and hold them there until their limbs were frozen solid and a coat of ice spread over the skin. He did this, timing how long it took for the human bodies to develop frostbites. Feeling satisfied at that, he would then use different methods for rapidly thawing of the frozen appendage, such as dousing them with hot water, open fire, or even leaving the subjects untreated and outside overnight to see how long it took for the prisoner's blood to thaw it out. Next is vivisection of conscious prisoners. For those who don't understand what vivisection is, it's actually a practice of performing operations on living beings for the purpose of experimentation or scientific research. To add to that, in Unit 731, this practice was done without anesthesia, and thousands of victims, mostly Chinese communist prisoners, including children and the elderly farmers, were subjected to this. These people were infected with diseases such as cholera and the plague, and their organs would be removed for examination before they died in order to study the effects of the disease without decomposition after death. Still in Unit 731, the Imperial Japanese Army too was also interested in the symptoms and treatment of syphilis, and male prisoners were therefore infected with this virus, and they were ordered to rape female and male prisoners to monitor the disease progression. The result of this was that many people were infected with syphilis. Yeah, as you'd expect. Some people in Unit 731 even went further in testing weapons on prisoners. They also studied flamethrowers on both covered and uncovered skin. These people also set up gas chambers to test subjects with blister agents and nerve gas. And not only that, but also the prisoners would be subjected to prolonged X-ray exposure, which sterilized and killed thousands of subjects. Unit 731 also had this thing of testing human limits, where human subjects would be locked up in a room and deprived of food and water to learn how long humans could survive without either. For those prisoners with injuries, they would have heavy objects dropped on them. Also, the effects of high G-forces on pilots and paratroopers were studied by loading human beings into large centrifuges and spun them at higher and higher speeds until they lost consciousness or died, which usually happened between 10 to 15 Gs. And if that wasn't enough, female prisoners of childbearing age were forcibly impregnated so that weapon and trauma experiments could be done on them. Pregnant women were also infected with various diseases, exposed to chemical weapons, crash injuries, shrapnel injuries, and bullet wounds, and then they were opened up and the effects on the fetuses were studied. This torture experiments left an indelible mark on the numbers, as around 10,000 to 12,000 prisoners were killed in the process. Number 5. Nazi medical experiments. The Nazis had a certain torture method where they would use their prisoners to test for infectious diseases and chemical warfare, while others would be forced to endure the harsh conditions in freezing temperatures and low-pressure chambers for aviation experiments. This led to many victims losing their lives in the process. There was also one woman, Ruth Elias, who had her breasts tied off with strings so that SS doctors could see how long it took for the baby to starve. Seeing the trauma she had gone through, the woman decided to do the most painful thing a mother will ever do by injecting a lethal dose of morphine to keep the baby from suffering any longer. Another one, Joseph Mengele, an SS physicist at Auschwitz during the Holocaust, did one of the most evil experiments of all time. Mengele combed the incoming trains for twins upon which to experiment with the hopes of proving his theories of the racial supremacy of Aryans. Many died in the process, and to make matters more satanic, Mengele would go ahead to collect eyes of his dead patients. Number 6. Electroshock therapy in children. Back in the 1960s, there was this woman doctor who believed that she could diagnose and cure children with social issues using electroshock therapy. Dr. Loretta Bender of New York's Creedmoor Hospital had methods that included interviewing and analyzing a sensitive child in front of a huge gathering. She would then apply a gentle amount of pressure onto the child's head, and any child who moved with the pressure was ruled out for schizophrenia. While doing this, she often appeared unsympathetic to the children in her care. It was then discovered that she herself was also a victim of misunderstood childhood, hence the hate. By the time her treatments were shut down, Bender had made a record by using electroshock therapy on over 100 children, the youngest of whom was 3 years old. With all this cruelty, I wonder if she really had a child. Number 7. The Tuskegee Study. In 1932, at a time when syphilis was more prevalent, a group of 600 African American men in Macomb County, Alabama, were enrolled for a project which aimed to study the full progression of the syphilis disease. With the promise of free medical care by the U.S. Public Health Service, or PHS, the men showed up with broad smiles and extreme confidence that this was their once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The group was then divided into two, of which 399 having latent syphilis, and the other control group of 201 being free from the disease. True to their expectations, a majority of them were treated from a variety of ailments or bad blood, a term commonly used in the area at the time. Constantly monitored by health workers, the men were given aspirin and mineral supplements, despite the fact that penicillin became the recommended treatment for syphilis in 1947, some 15 years into the study. PHS researchers later convinced the local physicians in Macomb County not to treat these men, but instead let them be, as they were research objects at the Tuskegee Institute. In order to track the disease's full progression, researchers provided no effective care to these men, and some died, as others went blind and insane or experienced a variety of other health conditions. Number 8. The Digestion Experiment on a Fur Trader. In 1822, a certain fur trader on Mackinac Island in Michigan was accidentally shot in the stomach and was treated by Dr. William Beaumont. Despite all the predictions, this man survived, but with a hole in his stomach that never seemed to heal. The man would later be put into torture by his doctor, who saw this as an opportunity to study the digestive process. Beaumont would tie food to a string and then insert it through the trader's stomach, and every few hours, Beaumont would remove the food to observe how it had been digested. Through a gruesome process, Beaumont's experiments led to the worldwide acceptance that digestion was a chemical and not a mechanical process. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Remember, knowledge is power.
Knowledge.